thanks for joining us. We really appreciate it. How are you, sir?
Good, man. Thanks for having me.
So I want to talk about the team. We'll talk about 2022, right? 2022. We'll talk about that here uh, coming up in a second. But I would like to get what I really love to do about Kentucky football is try to paint a picture for what it looked like when Mark Stoops was hired, and sort of what are the tangible difference that Mitch Barnhart and the Kentucky administration, as well as Mark Stoops, like what are the things that they have done over the last 10 years that has allowed Kentucky to find this like new level of success? Can you even begin to try to describe where they were when he was hired?
Well, so my first year covering Kentucky, I covered Virginia Tech for 8 years before I came to Kentucky, and it was a primarily football job, and then came to Kentucky to cover primarily a basketball program, but covered football too. And coming from Virginia Tech, where they had kind of built from nothing and were in the heyday back then. They were all 8 years I covered Virginia Tech. They won at least 10 games. They went to 4 or 5 BCS bowl games. They were in the mix. And so then I come to Kentucky, and I remember driving up the first day with my wife and pulling up to the stadium. Like, oh, this is SEC. They're not great, but at that time they had been to 5 straight bowl games. 2011 was the year, and under Rich Brooks, and then one year of Joker. So they've been to 5 bowl games. And I think, well, they're pretty good, and it's SEC football. Like, I can't wait to see the stadium. And I pull up, and it was a dump, frankly. Like, it was Commonwealth Stadium was a dump. It was really underwhelming. And, then the season starts, and I think they went 5-7 that first year. And the second year, 2012, they go 2-10. And the last game of Joker Phillips' tenure, the actual attendance was like 15,000. In a 70,000 seat stadium. It was bad, and they were not competitive. That summer, I think they had lost like a secret scrimmage, 7-on-7 scrimmage to Eastern Kentucky. They had OVC level talent in the SEC. I mean, they had the famous line when they lost to Western Kentucky, or almost lost. I can't remember. They had a run where they almost lost some years and lost a couple years to Western Kentucky. But in one of those games, the famous line, one of the Western Kentucky guys on the sideline got caught by the ESPN camera saying they're supposed to be SEC. They were down bad. The facilities were horrible. The practice facility, it was this old 30, 40-year-old dumpy old building, small. Didn't have, at the time, I don't even think it had a synthetic turf practice field. I mean, it was bad, and the talent level was really bad. I mean, I remember when Stoops got hired, some of his coaches, I'd see them after practice, and I go, "How's it going?" They go, "Going to recruit." Basically, like, these guys suck, and we need some better ones. And so to paint a picture of how bad it was, I mean, they had the second worst facilities in the league. Vanderbilt will probably never get out of that basement, even with the renovations. But certainly, at that point, it was them and Vanderbilt. And they were, at that time, they were a worse program than Vanderbilt, because Vanderbilt was actually enjoying a little bit of success. And it is hard to just to really, even with all that, to put into context just how bad things were. And so what has happened, to frame up what has happened since then, upon hiring Stoops, you go, the thought had always been you had to hire, in Kentucky, you couldn't just win traditionally. You had to go hire Mike Leach and Guy Morris and all those, the air raid. You had to have an air raid. You had to have a gimmick. Hal Mummy. I said Guy Morris. Hal Mummy. But they kind of basically decided, we're going to try to actually do this right, not try to gimmick our way into wins. So they go and hire this vaunted defensive coordinator who, with pedigree, had coached the greatest defense in history at Miami. At Florida State, he had built up that defense, which I think the year after he left, they won the national title. Stoops was responsible for a lot of that. And they start kind of building it like an actual infrastructure. Right. Like, you hire a guy who wants to culture is that word that gets thrown around, but really truly build a culture. Who, the thing that really impressed everybody about him and sold them on him, even though he hadn't been a head coach, is that he had a plan. Like, you need a rock solid long forward thinking vision and plan to win at a place like Kentucky, to win anywhere, but some places kind of run themselves if you just don't fall all over yourself. A place like Kentucky, like you got to really know what you're doing. And so he had a plan, and then Kentucky made a commitment, right? They immediately promised him, I think the same day or week that they announced Stoops, it all runs together now. It's been a decade, but they basically in the same moment they're hiring Stoops, they say, we are going to fix the stadium. And so they put $160 million, basically gave the stadium a whole facelift, and it's a totally different building now. Within a few years of that, they give Stoops a $50 million practice facility that is state of the art. It's as nice as anything in the SEC. Coming soon, he had one more demand. He wanted a better indoor facility, and they're going to address that. And so they've brought their facilities up to big boy SEC football level. They pay their coaches big boy money. I mean, Stoops has gotten all these raises. His deal now pays him up to like $8.5 million. He's one of the 10 or 15 highest paid coaches in college football at Kentucky. They've got 3 assistants who average over $1 million a year on their contracts, both coordinators and their recruiting coordinator, Vince Marrow, who's been key to this whole thing. He's been with Stoops the whole time, make over $1 million a year. So like they got in the arms race for one, and then they committed to this vision. They stuck with Stoops through some hard times. His first year, they go 2-10 because they had that dog meat talent. But he immediately started upgrading that talent. Yeah. And, he treated, there's not enough talent in Kentucky to sustain an SEC program, but they got the best players to stay home, the handful that there were. And then he did the smartest thing that has happened in the modern Kentucky football era, which was adopt Ohio as local recruiting, because it's right there. Cincinnati's an hour away. Cincinnati is Kentucky.
It's sitting right there. If you visit Cincinnati, all the best breweries are in Kentucky.
Basically a major metropolitan area in another state is really in your state. It's just like right across the water. And then a lot of other places. And, Stoops is rooted in Youngstown, Ohio, and there's a lot of talent from there. Lynn Bowden, he got out of there. He realized, and Vince Marrow's from Youngstown. Like his staff is very Youngstown. I think there's now 4 guys from Youngstown on the staff, and they just hit Ohio hard. And they realized like Ohio State, 1, is recruiting nationally, and 2 is only going to take so many. They're only the very top guys, and that leaves a whole bunch. I mean, Ohio is one of the most talented states in the country, and Kentucky for years it was like, especially under Joker, it was this mentality that like, okay, we can't go get the best players in the country. We just can't win 4- and 5-star battles. So we're going to go try to get the hidden gems who are the 3rd tier guys in Georgia and Florida and Alabama. And like, okay, so you're getting the 3rd choice from all the states that house the programs you're trying to beat. How is that going to work? And so they went to Ohio, and that's where they built their talent base up. I mean, you dramatically upgrade your talent when you have, OVC level talent to start with, and then you're getting 4 stars that were just not good enough to go to Ohio State, but they could have gone. They used to go to Michigan State and Penn State and Iowa and other places, and help Big Ten teams win. Now you are the northernmost SEC program selling the SEC, and you're basically saying stay home and play in the SEC. Stay home and play in the SEC. If you weren't good enough to go to Ohio State, do you want to go to the 2nd tier Big Ten school, or do you want to stay home and play in the SEC? And they leveraged all their relationships, lifelong relationships in Ohio. I mean, the Stoops and Marrow are the most connected people in the state of Ohio outside of anybody in the Ohio State family.
Yep.
And so, that was a stroke of genius. And over time, they got these guys like Benny Snell, the all-time leading rusher, and Lynn Bowden, the most dynamic guy since Randall Cobb that's played there. And then you hit a couple home runs. You recruit and develop. You get a guy like Josh Allen, who was a 2-star recruit, and only Fordham was offering him out of New Jersey. They couldn't get Rutgers to give him an offer, and he develops over his career, kind of like Bjorn Warner had done under Stoops at Florida State, a no-name recruit who becomes the National Defensive Player of the Year. That happened for Josh Allen, and he's a top 10 pick. And all of a sudden, now you don't just have to recruit Kentucky and Ohio. Now Kentucky can recruit more nationally. Now Kentucky is going into places like Georgia and Florida and Alabama and getting 4-star players. And they've expanded their recruiting footprint. And all the while these blueprint drawings of stuff we're going to build get built. And then you go from 2 wins Stoops' first year to 5 wins his second and third year to 7 wins his fourth and fifth year. And then you jump up in his 6th year, they have a 10-win season, which they hadn't had in 40 years. And now after last year, they've had 2 of those in the last 4 years. And you find Kentucky at this place that, to me, circling back to like what were they when he started, it's really unfathomable that they've made these strides. They are now in a period of 6 straight bowl games. They've won 3 or 4 in a row. They've won, 2 New Year's Day bowl games against against ranked Big Ten opponents, Penn State and Iowa, in the Citrus Bowl. They won a Gator Bowl. That's just not stuff Kentucky ever did. I mean, that ever did. They've climbed the pecking order to, I would say they're no worse than the number 3 team in the East now, sort of in a over a window of time, let's say over the last 6 years. They're the 2nd or 3rd best program in the East. And that's really never been the case.
Yeah, it is remarkable journey that the entire program has been on for this last decade. I think a lesson for everyone outside of like the top 5% of college football. It should be a lesson on how to operate a program for almost everybody, like from a strategic standpoint, a tactical standpoint. So I think that's a great picture of where they're at. Let's look at the team this year real quick. And obviously Liam Cohen leaves, probably, regrets not being in Los Angeles that for the year that they win the Super Bowl.
Right.
But they go out and sort of hire another guy similar to him from the Shanahan tree. And so when you bring in Will Levis, all the talk with Mark Stoops has been the offense and the evolution. You get a guy that now is getting 1st round draft pick consideration. The offense didn't evolve a ton last year, but it was certainly much better. But Wan'Dale Robinson's gone. So do all the pieces fit together? How does Mark Stoops continue the offense and the evolution with a quarterback who's pretty talented from an arm standpoint, with a new coordinator and some new weapons? How does that snowball keep rolling downhill for them?
Yeah, and that was the thing too, when you talk about sort of evolving and taking the next step. Like they built this thing on run the football and play defense, and then until partially by necessity, because they never had a game-changing quarterback. And now Stoops realized before they even had the game-changing quarterback in Levis and the wide open coordinator in Liam Cohen last year, he realized, like, okay, we've become way too predictable. I mean, they were a horrible passing team. The passing game went away from their offense, and he made a change. Eddie Grant had he'd been part of the architecture of building the program, and he let him go. He's actually now back. He joined back up with them last year in kind of an analyst role, because they have a great relationship. But Stoops said, hey, we've stagnated. We've got to make a change. And so he goes to the NFL, pulls from that tree, the McVay-Shanahan tree, gets this transfer quarterback who his new coordinator saw before anyone was a perfect fit for what he wanted to do. Will Levis couldn't get off the bench. He was like the change of pace, run only quarterback at Penn State. And he's got this huge rocket arm. And by the end of last season, you could see that he threw for almost 3,000 yards. He ran for about 400 yards. He's hurdling people. He's, throwing missiles to Wan'Dale Robinson. He leads the game winning drive, in the bowl game. And even with the coordinator change, when they had to get a new guy, Stoops was very committed to the style and the continuity of get somebody like that, get somebody from that same family of offenses. You go get Rich from the 49ers, who's a quarterback whisperer. You bring him in, and he takes one look at Will Levis and says, like, this guy is as good. He told me he's as good as any quarterback in the last 2 drafts, which is crazy to hear somebody say. And I think at least one mock draft had Will Levis maybe going number 1, which I don't know that we're going to see that. But I mean, almost everybody right now has him in the 1st round. And a lot of people have him in the top 10. And I don't think it's crazy. I mean, when you look at his physical tools, and also you got to weigh that against what else is out there. And there's, is there just like a no doubt quarterback right now at the NFL level? I'm not sure. I think, though, going from really not have the last time they had just an absolute game-changing quarterback. I mean, you could say Jared Lorenzen, but probably go all the way back to Tim Couch when they had a number one. They're
What's the deal with you don't love Andre Woodson? Hate
well,
on Andre Woodson.
No, you're right. Woodson.
Come on now.
Okay, we'll give Woodson. Okay, so Woodson is the closest thing in between Couch and now Woodson.
Yeah.
But, did he even get drafted? I'm not sure he even got drafted.
No, he was not an NFL player, but
Right.
he did hold a lot of
he had set a bunch of SEC records.
Yeah,
and at one point, they were deep into that season, 2007, where they upset number one LSU. Deep into that season, he was like the Heisman front runner. So I think that is a disservice to Andre Woodson and a good guy.
Come on, Kyle, come on.
But it's been a while. I mean, it tells you how long it was also before my time on the beat, but it has been, 14, 15 years since they even had a guy that was like in the conversation. And so now they have that guy again. And I think the difference was like Jared Lorenzen was not surrounded by a ton of talent. Andre Woodson was surrounded by good talent, in the modern era of Kentucky football, pretty good talent. They had a handful of guys that ended up playing in the NFL, but not near. If you think about, compare those rosters that Lorenzen and Woodson played on to what this roster is, like they've built up all around. Kentucky had gotten good everywhere. They'd done some of the stuff that people said you couldn't do at Kentucky. I mentioned earlier, you got to be gimmicky because you can't recruit SEC offensive and defensive linemen at Kentucky. Well, they have. I mean, they've had one of the best offensive lines in the country. They've had great running backs. They've had star wide receivers. They've had the unanimous National Player of the Year on defense, Defensive Player of the Year. And so they've built up all the talent around it, and they just lacked that quarterback. It's like if you dropped Lorenzen or Woodson into this roster, like you'd think Kentucky could make a run at this thing. And that's what they think they've done, I think, with Will Levis. And Will Levis may be more talented than either of those guys. And so, when I asked Stoops, I said, I ask you every year, like we do the state of the program at the Athletic, and every year it's like, okay, you kept climbing or you've maintained. I always say, how do you take that next step? And they're at the point now where they finished twice to Georgia, second in the East, twice to Georgia in the last 4 years. They've gotten to a game in late October or November against Georgia, one at home in 2018, last year on the road in Athens, where if they win that game, they are going to win the East.
Well, and they played Georgia probably as well as anybody in the comp last
not really
year.
Close, but closer than anybody other than Alabama.
Right, exactly.
And so, they've gotten to this point where it's truly, how do you take the next step means how do you win the East? And one, that's really hard. I'm not sure you can do it. But if there is a way, when you've built up everything else, to finally have a potential, like not just good, but maybe star, really, truly game-changing, dynamic star quarterback, is to me the only potential answer. Because like if you look at look at Joe Burrow. Joe Burrow, it's kind of a similar type of story. I'm not comparing the two. I'm just saying.
No, I totally see where you're going here.
Couldn't get off the bench at Ohio State. He transfers to LSU. He has like a good, solid first year at LSU. And by the end of the year, he leads them to a bowl victory. I think they won like 8 games the year before they go undefeated. And everybody's saying that's like the greatest team ever. But the year before that, he was pretty good and they were pretty good. They weren't great. LSU wasn't great. But the year 2 of him with Joe Brady, he gets this rock star coordinator. He just takes off like a rocket, and they take off like a rocket. I mean, we all know this. This is why quarterbacks are all of the conversation. They are the biggest money because they are the difference maker. If you don't, it's the reason that crappy quarterbacks get drafted in the first round, because you got to try to find one. If you're an NFL team that doesn't have one, it's like, give me the best of these crappy quarterbacks because I got to try to hit on one. You have to have a quarterback. Kentucky hasn't had a really good one since Andre Woodson. And if they have one now, does that what is that worth, I guess? Like what's the wins above replacement for, if Will Levis turns out to be a star, does that put him, do they get to that November game with Georgia again this year, playing for the SEC East?
It's funny, where there's no original takes. I think the comp from Kentucky, the 10 wins with Levis in his first year after being a backup in the Big Ten and transferring, you're 100% right. Like, I'm not suggesting that he's going to throw for 5,600 yards this year and they're going to win the national title. But like the story parallels are obvious, and I have not heard that before. So you get full credit on comp. That's very astute of you. Let's wrap up here with the schedule this year. It does kind of set up a little bit. I know they got to play at Florida early. You got to go to Tennessee, Ole Miss on the road, but is Ole Miss as good? I think Mississippi State's pretty good this year. So it is some I think challenging again for another 10-win season is not out of the question, right? Is that what fans expecting this year?
Oh, I think that's absolutely the expectation. Yeah. I mean, which is a crazy thing. Like we've gotten to a point that, I talked to a lot of Kentucky fans, and that's just like last year, that was the expectation. They're going to win 10 or 11 games. And it is even, I would say even more so this year. I mean, we have gotten to a point where there's a lot of the Kentucky football fan base that would be deeply disappointed and angry if they didn't win at least 8 games. Like winning 8 would probably feel like a failure to a lot of people this year. Winning less than 8 would be, they would be outraged. And I remember, it's funny, everything, expectation, and it changes over time. If you do something long enough, then like what once was good enough is no longer good enough.
Right.
But if we're talking about 10 years ago, we started this conversation about where was the program when Stoops took over. People would actually say all the time, like not a small amount of people, almost everybody I talked to who cared about Kentucky football would say, give me someone who can get us back to winning 7 games and getting to a bowl game. Like if he does that every year, we'll build him a statue. Yeah. and that is no longer true. Like he has done that, right? So 7, 10, 8. They had the COVID year, but still got to a bowl, but with a losing record and won it. And then 10. So they've basically been 7+ for 6 straight years now, and they've been to a bowl game every year. He's in his worst year, he's done that minimum level of expectation, but he's raised the bar because now, I mean, they won 8 games in a year where they literally didn't have a quarterback. Not like they didn't have like a good quarterback. They moved Lynn Bowden to quarterback, snapped him the ball, and he ran every play, and they won 8 games, and they lost 2 that year. I think that by like 3 points. So, they could have won 10 games with no quarterback. And so Stoops has done some pretty crazy stuff. And so now the bar is, it's got to be 10 wins.
Well, I appreciate it, man. Thank you for your time. It is, I have sort of long been supportive of Stoops' Kentucky marriage. I think even before they got to 10 wins, I had him finishing second in the East last year, which I don't think a lot of people did out there. So I'd like to think I'm sort of like carrying the torch here for Kentucky football. But it's because I believe in the philosophy and how it's like being done. I think it's the right way to do it. And I know that's sort of a cliche, but I just think it is. And so
it's a little old school. I mean, I said, I covered Virginia Tech, and Frank Beamer used to always say, like, he had a losing season his 6th year. And like in no world now would you survive that. Year 7, he begins a run of like 27 consecutive bowl games. It's pretty old school to stick with your guy and let him sort of slow build it. And that's what they've done here.
Literally with a lunch pail every practice. So that's how you do it.
Virginia
Thank
Tech,
you so much. Thank you so much, man. Of course, you can check him out all over The Athletic. We really appreciate it. Kyle, thank you, man.
Thank you.